All right. Well, I want to thank you for letting me join remotely. I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank all of my amazing colleagues that contributed to this presentation. So there are a lot of people on the WyACT team, Wyoming Anticipating the Climate Water Transition, that are co-authors on this presentation. And today I really want to, and those are listed here on the slide, I want to share with you some work that we've done on perceptions, values, and what people are doing currently to adapt so that we can think a little bit more about how this baseline of information influences how we might think about the future. And sorry, I'm not in the right place. Yes. So I wanted to give you a little plan for what I'm going to present today. I'm going to present a little bit of background where I talk about what we mean by futures thinking, how community knowledge can help us understand water futures, and what are the most effective levers of change for changing what the future might be around water in the state. And then I have 3 different projects on all through WyACT. Some of them were partially funded through other grants as well, on perceptions, values, and current behavior. And then I'll do a little summary and conclusions at the end. So first off, I just want to talk about what do we mean when we're talking about water futures and what tools are available to do that. We can think about trend analysis, which is kind of projecting the trends that we're seeing currently into the future. We can think about forecasting, which is partially trend analysis with a little bit of disruptive events that might happen to change the future. We can think about backcasting, where we think about the future that we want to be in, and then we work our way backwards to think about, okay, how do we get to that future that we want? Envisioning is a tool that just helps us think about what kind of future do we want before maybe we do that backcasting process. And so these are sort of 4 approaches to thinking about the future. On the WyACT team, we have a wonderful group of colleagues that are working on scenario planning, which is a tool that helps us use both kind of bring together forecasting and also a little bit of visioning to think about what the future might be. And we have a colleague in the room there, Mary Keller, who's going to speak a little bit more about some of her work with scenario planning later today. So we'll talk about that later today, but I just wanted to give you a sense of like, what are the tools that help us think about the future? And then when we're thinking about the future, we're really thinking about collective changes in behavior. And so, you know, how the future will emerge happens from individual behaviors adding up to collectives. And so this theory of planned behavior is a theory that helps us understand how behavior happens and what aspects or attributes are contributing to behavior. And so this graphic kind of shows us what the theory of planned behavior says. We've got background factors, they influence beliefs, and then attitudes, norms, and perceived control, which influence intention, and then the belief itself. So today, the projects that I'm going to talk about relate to perceptions. They also relate to values. And we're also going to talk a little bit about some behaviors that we're seeing currently. And hopefully all of this together will help us think about what could we expect in the future. So the next thing I wanted to draw your attention to before we get into these projects is thinking about leverage points for effective change. And so this diagram comes from Donella Meadows' work, and it talks about which things are influencing most the future. And today we're going to be, talking about values and perceptions, which are here on some of the strongest levers of future, of how the future is impacted. And so just wanted to show you that things like, our values, our mental models, our assumptions and trust are some of the things that really influence and affect change the most. All right, so moving on, I'm going to first start talking about a survey that my colleague Kristen Landerville, who's also online with me, conducted across the state of Wyoming to understand how people in Wyoming perceive water resources currently. Really interesting study, interesting work. I think you'll find. The first thing that I want to highlight is that across Wyoming, and this is a survey that was just conducted last year, the majority of people, I think 86% of the population of Wyoming, say that climate change is happening. So this is, maybe a little interesting to all of you. I think that, that's a high percentage of our population that believe that climate change is happening. But as you can see from this figure, only 47% are saying that it's not due to humans. So this is an interesting dynamic in our state. And then if you look over here, 82% believe that Wyoming is susceptible to changing water resources. So that's a very large percentage. But as people are asked questions that come down into the local area or more sort of nuanced local perspective, that level of agreement becomes a little bit less so. So you're seeing about 45% say my local area is feeling the effects of climate change. And next, I want to share this graphic, which is very interesting. Wyoming residents overarchingly believe that it's both wise and necessary to adapt to changes in water resources. So that's great news for us in thinking about the future of water in Wyoming. Most people do see this as an important resource and something that we should be taking action on. If you look below, you'll also see that people think that industries and primarily local government should be taking more action on these issues. And so there's a clear, desire for action to happen and kind of clear perspectives on who should be taking that action. Next, and I think that this is one of the most fascinating things that came out of Kristen's work, is that there's a disconnect between what people are saying they believe and what they think their community believes. And so here you can see that 75% of Wyoming residents who answered this survey believe that changes in water resources are happening. But only 38% believe that their community thinks that changes in water resources are happening. And you can see the same disconnect in planning for change. 81% say that they believe communities should be planning for change, but only 49% believe that their community also thinks this. And so this disconnect is really important to understand when we're thinking about the future of water in the state. And this difference in opinion or this misperception needs to be addressed so that we can work together more collaboratively over water resources in the future. All right, next I'm going to switch, and I'm sorry there's a lot to cover here, but to a study that a grad student, Pallavi Pokharel, conducted through storytelling interviews in the Snake and Green River water basins to understand how people value water across the state. And she asked people to share stories around water, and then she coded them for various types of values. And today I'm going to mainly focus on instrumental values and on relational values, just because we have limited time. So in terms of instrumental values, almost every participant discussed at least one theme under instrumental values. These were often aligned to their identity and their livelihoods. So, based on how they used water, those are the ways that they talked about their instrumental values. And on average, they were coded 6 times throughout the story about how they used water. So instrumental values are really values about how you use the resource. Now, next, I want to show you relational values. So relational values are values that people get from interacting both with the water resource and with one another around that water resource. And so interestingly, every participant, without fail, discussed at least one theme under relational values. It was the most frequently coded value. And in comparison with instrumental values, it was coded 16 times by each person. So this was an average across interviews. And so on average, each interviewee talked about relational values at least 16 times in comparison with the 6 times that they talked about instrumental values. Things like knowledge exchange, sense of place, sense of community, stewardship, and memory came up with this. And I want to just share a diagram that Pallavi is working on for a paper that we're going to submit soon. I think this is really interesting because it's showing, what these storytelling interviews are telling us about the connection between instrumental values and relational values. And here you see that by using water through their livelihoods or through their recreation, they're increasing their amount of relational values. And then you can also see kind of in the middle there how relational values are also all interconnected with one another. And so they're supporting each other and they're, kind of synergistic. And then you can also see this is like the size, the number of codes for each of these. And so memory was very large here. But this is a really interesting finding, I think, in Wyoming. Um, because what we're seeing is that relational values are really important to people. And what Pallavi is suggesting through this research is that there might be social flows that we want to think about with water in addition to ecological or biological flows. So when we're thinking about the value of in-stream flow, we might want to consider not just how that's, improving habitat for species, but how that's contributing to these relational values that people care about. All right. So I'm going to the third project, looking at current behavior. This was one of our graduate students, Callie Serber, who did a project interviewing both Indigenous and non-Indigenous agriculturalists in the Wind River Basin. And as we know, agriculture uses the majority of water in the state. And so understanding how people perceive changes and how they're adapting to them is very important. And so, one of the most interesting things that we found is that we framed this study not around climate change, but around changes that were of interest and um, concern to ranchers. And so, this diagram is a diagram that Callie created to show perceptions of agency, and basically, what we're seeing here is that as the spatial and temporal scale increases, that's where ranchers see less agency. So things like land use policy, macroeconomic changes are things that they feel like they have very little control over. Things like changing water availability. People talked about how they are adapting year to year, every year, to environmental variability. And so for them, that was something that they felt like actually on a ranch scale, they had more control over than other factors on their ranch. So this was very interesting. And part of the reason I think that we're seeing this is described in this diagram that Callie also drafted. So in the interviews, people talked about a lot of risk factors with water, things like human demand, environmental water availability, in stream flow, and industry being risk factors to the water that they had available for agriculture. But they also talked about a lot of perceived insulating factors. So in the Wind River, people often talked about having senior water rights, having the proximity to the headwaters, being east of the Continental Divide, um, the fact that Wyoming water policy often supported their use of water. And so those were perceived insulating factors, which meant that their overall level of concern was maybe lower than the risk would suggest because they felt like these various things were insulating them from that issue. And one thing that this suggests to us is that based on the watershed that you're working on in Wyoming in the specific context, there may be lowered perceptions of risk because of some of these insulating factors. All right. So I just want to summarize for us right here and think about, what do all of these various studies tell us about Wyoming water futures? I think first, it's clear from that survey that Wyoming residents are concerned about water. This is also clear from the values-related work that Pallavi did, and also the interviews that were done with ranchers in the Wind River. There is concern around water. People care about water, and not just because they use it. I think the strength of those relational values that people were seeing in those storytelling interviews is really important, and something that, although research in the past has sort of suggested that Indigenous populations have these multiple levels of value around water, This is one of the first studies that I know of that is really looking at non-Indigenous communities in the state and really documenting how they value and care about water. Because of all of this, I think that there's a great potential that Wyoming residents may be willing to seek collaborative solutions around water. We saw that in Allison Hagee's talk. We saw that in Anne's talk as well, that people are interdependent and they are working together to think about solutions around water. Um, but this is really interesting, kind of this comparison with statewide perspectives and um, the perspectives from agricultural water users. Because of agricultural water users and their year-to-year adaptation, they may not be as concerned about changes to water because they may feel like it's something that they have control over in their own agricultural properties. And that is because some of those contextual factors like distance from the headwaters may make agricultural water users feel insulated. So that's all I have to share with you today. I'm sorry I had to kind of rush through some of that, but I really appreciate being here.